Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're gonna get started here. My name is Eric Olson, and I want to welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson Center on behalf of the Mexico Institute. We are delighted today to have with us Professor Sergio Aguayo Quezada from the Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City, a longtime friend, personal friend, actually. I'm honored to call him a personal friend, but also a great friend of the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Mexico Institute. He is a member of our advisory board committee and has been an invaluable partner with us as we've carried out our work on Mexico. This lecture today is part of what we call our Diálogos con México, Dialogues with Mexico series. It's an opportunity, a space that we make available to scholars and leaders from Mexico who come to Washington and would have something important to help us understand the reality of what's going on in Mexico. And we're delighted to make Sergio Aguayo presentation today part of that series. I wanted to just recognize a few additional people here in addition to our speakers. Andrew Seeley, the director of the Mexico Institute, I believe has arrived. He's under my nose. My apologies. And so we're glad to have him here. I don't know if you want to say anything as you're putting food in your mouth. I'm sorry. But also I wanted to recognize Lázaro Cárdenas Batel. Where's Lázaro? Oh, there's Lázaro. Boy, I'm just missing everybody. Lázaro has been a fellow here at the Mexico Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center and has collaborated with us and particularly with me in organizing these dialogues with Mexico events. And so we're delighted to count him also as a friend and collaborator with the Mexico Institute. And then other members of our advisory committee are here, Diana Negroponte, our good friend Dolly Esteves. Who am I missing? Jim Jones. Oh, Ambassador Jim Jones, I saw earlier. Ambassador Crescencio Arcos is also here. So thank you. And we have another fellow at the Institute, Professor Daniel Levine, who's joining us as well. Many of you know his works. Many of you, I'm sure, have read his works in your graduate courses, so we're delighted to have him here. Anyway, I won't take any more time. As I say, we're delighted to have Sergio Aguayo here, a professor at the Colegio de Mexico for many years, a prolific writer and author both of scholarly work on security issues and democracy in Mexico, but also a regular columnist with the Reforma. He appears regularly on a TV talk show of much better quality that we have in this country as a political pundit and commentator, and also has just an extraordinary resume of work in favor of democracy and transparency and openness in Mexico from a really honestly, truthfully, nonpartisan perspective, which is always something I've just greatly admired about Sergio's work. Any of the major developments in democracy work in Mexico have Sergio's fingerprints on them, I would say, in the last 20, 30 years. He was one of the founding members of the collective that started La Jornada, right?
Yes, right.
Right, I'm remembering that correctly. He was a founding member of Alianza Cívica, which was an important social movement that did electoral monitoring and advocacy during the 1990s. He was one of the founders of Fundar, an organization that works on transparency and governance. The list goes on and on. So it's just a tremendous honor to have him with us, and he's presenting to us today two of his latest books, a long list of books he's written, but two of the latest ones. They're for sale out in the foyer. We invite you to take those home. with you. So I'm going to turn it over to Sergio here in a minute, and then invite two close colleagues and also experts on Mexico to make commentary on these books, and then we'll open it up for dialogue. I'll turn first to Professor John Bailey from Georgetown University's Department of Government and School of Foreign Service, where he directs the Mexico Project, and then also Todd Eisenstadt, a associate professor in the School of Government, School of Public Affairs. I always get that wrong. At my alma mater, American University, and we're delighted to have him here as well. So, Sergio, the floor is yours. You have a brief PowerPoint presentation, I guess, and then we'll have some discussion.
I want to thank the Mexico Institute and Andrew Seeley and your generous presentation, Eric Olson. You remind everybody how old I am, which I don't mind. That's part of aging in an elegant way. The two books that I'm going to comment very, very briefly are The Consequence of a Depression. I was very depressed when I realized that democracy is not working in Mexico, that the hopes that we have put on Vicente Fox administration have been betrayed by Vicente Fox. As a matter of fact, I decided to write these two books after a dinner at Los Pinos in August 2003, when it became evident how Vicente Fox has become another cynic and corrupt politician. And his wife also was part of the same phenomenon. But I'm not going to deal into history. That's 7 years ago. It took me 7 years to write these two books, and I had the support of El Colegio de Mexico. I assembled a team of young researchers that helped me to comb archives in Mexico, throughout Mexico. So what you have is Vuelta, a U-turn. That's my analysis and interpretation of what has happened in Mexico with democracy from 1910 to 2010. And then its sister, which is a documentary history, commentated history of democracy in Mexico from 1910 to 2010, 1 century of the search for an elusive political system that we seem that we are incapable of reaching for whatever the reason. The answer is in the books. The answers are in the book. So I'm going to concentrate in the essence, the central thesis of the two books. Not thinking only in the past and not only trying to blame political party or an individual like Vicente Fox, however irresponsible and frivolous he is. But I want to concentrate on the future, because I think that's what is more important about the moment. And let me start by saying that my generation failed in creating a democracy that works. Mexican democratic institutions are not working. We are living a systemic crisis, and I realize this is a very strong statement 1 week after President Felipe Calderón came and presented a very rosy picture of how many schools he had inaugurated and how many hospitals he had built. Of course, I have a different perspective, but that's what democracy is about. I mean, the possibility of presenting alternative views, so you will have the opportunity to contrast the two opinions. So we made a mistake. Democracy is not failing, but for the future, I maintain that the empowerment of Mexican civil society is the key for the regeneration, the recovery of democracy. And in order for us to empower ourselves, we need the solidarity and understanding of U.S. society. Those are the central ideas that I'm going to present. with the alternation of political party in the presidential palace in Los Pinos, what we had in the last 10 years is a massive, unprecedented, peaceful redistribution of political, economic, and coercive power. Never before in the history of Mexico there has been so much redistribution of power as it has been the case in the last 10, 20 years. I'm going to present you with a few tables. The books are full of data, and I must say that this time I was extremely careful of substantiating with documents or figures any major thesis I maintain in the books, because I know that in the polarized moment we live, it is very important that I prove what I am saying. So I'm going to present you with a series of tables in which you can have an idea of this redistribution of power. How can I?
Oh, I think it's right there. It's on the bottom.
Oh, yes, Aguayo. Okay.
Oh, wait a minute. There you go.
Okay. Well, Mexican crisis and the U.S. First, this table is about income distribution, and which I want to highlight is how little has changed the monthly income per capita of most Mexicans. From 2000 to 2008, I mean, the poorest sector of the population, the 20% poorest, has increased only $7 a month. So they have $27 a month. So that's the income of 20%, and so on and so forth. So democracy has not served to redistribute the unequal distribution of income. I'm going to leave in the Woodrow Wilson Center the presentation for whoever wants a presentation, and this data is in the book, in U-turn mostly. What we did have was the creation of a new generation of Mexican billionaires. This table is made out of the yearly report of Forbes magazine that started in 1987. At that year, there was only one billionaire in Mexico, the Garza Sada family, that had $2 billion. In 2010, there were 9 with $90 billion. Yesterday, we learned that there are 10 Mexican billionaires with $124 billion. So there has been an increase of $30 billion in 1 year. How these fortunes were made, it's at the crux of the Mexican economic model, which has been the consequence of a policy of systematically favoring the wealthiest in the Mexican population. An example, tax refunds. Just to give you an idea, the 50 largest enterprises in Mexico paid from 2000 and 2005 $6.78 cents a year. That's the amount they paid every year in the first 5 years of the Fox administration. The Fox administration, by the way, increased about 100% the amount of the returns given by the Treasury to individual contributors. As for the value-added tax, they paid $6 every year. I pay much more every month. A middle-income family in Mexico pays a lot more than Telmex or Cemex or the biggest companies. And this is a government policy that has been created to favor the richest. The second redistribution of power, that was economic power. In the case of the budgets, there has been a massive transfers of federal resources to municipalities and states. As you can see in this table, Ernesto Zedillo was the president that increased almost 20% the amount of money that is transferred to states and municipalities. And that means that every year, in 2010, about $80 billion were transferred to municipalities, and half of that is not accountable. So governors have the capacity to control every year about $40 billion that they can use at their discretion. That explains why governors are now such important players in the presidential elections, and that is the power that the Mexican presidents used to have was transferred in many ways to states and municipalities. Then we have another transfer of power, in this case to trade unions. One of the most perverse and spectacular example is the group of Elbester Gordillo, the leader of the teachers' union. She was named the General Secretary, or now President of the Teachers Union in 1989. And she has been able to accumulate an enormous wealth because she has been very skillful in creating the most sophisticated electoral machine in the country. What Elbester does is very simple. She has one of the most sophisticated intelligence units to follow electoral affairs. So she is capable of knowing who is ahead of the polls. When she has that information, she goes to the candidate, be that Vicente Fox, Calderon, or Gabriela Cuevas in the federal district, or whatever, because they go to all levels and offer them a deal. We can help you, and that I have interviewed people that have received the offers, and what she offers, or she or members of her team, is we can mobilize voters on election day. His group was able to mobilize 1 million votes in favor of Calderon in the 2006 presidential election. And Elbester Gordillo asked in exchange for positions in which his group handles budgets, so she can reproduce and increase the size of her political machinery. It's a woman with immense power. You cannot believe. I just put in this table a very conservative estimate of the budgets she handles from 2007 to 2009. The minimum is $25 billion. The maximum is $119 billion in those 3 years. She has more budget than the federal district or the state of Mexico. So that gives you an idea, of the perversion that, because this is one consequence of a democratic system that is not working, because everybody knows that Elbester Gordillo is doing that, and the electoral authority does not act because they are too afraid. They are too subjected to the political parties and to the powers that be, that they let Elbester Gordillo and governors and many others do whatever they want. That's why elections don't have much trust in Mexico. Then we have political parties. This is the cost of elections in Mexico. We have spent in the last decade $14 billion. That's the cost of elections in Mexico, federal and local. In the book I present, not in the book, in my page I will put all the figures state by state, and it is very impressive to observe how the transfer of state money to political parties has increased 32%, because the governors are the one now controlling or trying to control local political parties at the local level, and they have the money to do that. So political parties, one consequence is that political parties don't represent society. They are representing entrepreneurs, governors, trade unions, cartels, but not necessarily societies. That's another perversion of our democracy, and that's why our democracy is not working. Then we have organized crime. I could speak hours of this topic because I have been following it. I'm going to compare only a few tables. One is the famous speech of Felipe Calderón in February 2007, the first time that the Mexican president gives the names of the states or gives an estimate of the power of the cartels. On that day, after a few weeks after he declared war on drugs, he announced that 8 states had been kidnapped by cartels. Baja California, Chihuahua, Nuevo León, Tamaulipas, Durango, Sinaloa, Michoacán, and Guerrero. 40% of the territory. Last year, the federal government presented this map with the 162 most violent municipalities in 18 states. What I want to point out at this moment is the diversification, the expansion of the power, of territorial power of the cartels. And you can see that they are everywhere. These are only the municipalities with more crimes, not the places where the cartels are present. It's different. And according to the federal government, 22,000 members of the cartels have been killed in these 3 years, in these years, from December 2006 to July 2010, 3 years and a half. Now, I'm going to recuperate later these 22,000 members of the cartels that have been eliminated. Take this table, the comparison of 3 governments. Felipe Calderón is right when he says that he has been the most aggressive president and that he has been willing to challenge the cartels. There is no doubt about it. If you compare the seizures of cocaine, marijuana, arms, and so on, he's far ahead of Cedillo and Fox. If you look at arrests, the figure, 115,000 people have been arrested as committing crimes related to drug activity. In another presentation given by Alejandro Poire, he said that out of those 115,000, about 82,000 are members of the cartels. 82,000 that have been detained. I don't know if convicted. That's another matter, but 82,000 had been detained. 22,000 had been killed. That makes about 100,000 elements. And the cartels still have the capacity to be present everywhere. Then the question is, what is the size of the cartels? If they have lost 100,000 and still have the capacity to be present, perhaps the answer is here, the prices of cocaine. $800 as the paste, and $100,000 the retail price in Philadelphia or Chicago. The price in Mexico is $8,300. The price in wholesale price in Miami or Dallas, $21,000. This is the reason, and this is the basic economics of the drug war are in this table. We are in a strategic stalemate. I hope that the state succeeds, but the question is if the strategy being followed by the federal government is the right one or not. I don't want to enter into that, but there is no doubt that the capacity that presidentialism, authoritarian presidentialists had to control weapons and violence is gone. Coercive power is distributed to drug cartels, to many drug cartels in different parts of the country. Now, let's move to the future. I'm going to present you with a few tables of the World Survey of Values, World Value Survey, that has been made since 1981. So this gives an idea of the values of Mexican society. We are in a limbo. We are in the middle of democratic and authoritarian values. And this table is very clear. 80% of us support democracy. But 41% want the army in government, in power. 65% believe that bribes are justified. 60% that tax evasion is justified. It's increasing tax evasion. And yet, 55% respect human rights. And only 30% reject gay neighbors. So, this is a picture, a mural of a contradictory society. We are a contradictory society. We don't know what we are. We are a mixture of values: conservative, democratic, authoritarian, machistic. Whom do we trust? Family, church, and the feminist movement. Yes. In our values, and this line of the surveys is an expression of how much machismo is on the way out. We are now willing to recognize women's rights, at least rhetorically. And that's a major change. If you look that in 1995, only 44% of the population respected feminists in Mexico. Now it's 65%. Then let's go down. We spent billions of dollars in political parties, and we don't respect political parties. Something is wrong with our democracy. I mean, when you don't respect, I know that political parties are not respected universally, but I mean, Congress, police, judicial system, and government, systematically, all the institutions that are supposedly the pillars of democracy are despised by Mexicans. Something is not working properly, at least at the terms of values. Then, attitude towards politics. I have another survey to substantiate the idea that about 20% of the population is willing to participate in public life. We are a minority, but that's a minority that can save democracy, because I want to remind you of one fact that I found in the research. Society pays the cost of the struggles for democracy that benefited political parties. When political parties received the benefits with electoral reforms, they excluded society. That has been from the beginning. From 1963, the electoral reform of 63, the electoral reform of 77, and of 96. That must change. That must change because political parties are not doing their jobs. We are, according to the Index of Transparency International, a more corrupt society than before the alternation of power. In 1998, we were 3.3%. In 2010, we are 3.1%. In 1998, we were in the 55th position in the world. We are now in the 98th position. We have gone down. I mean, honesty, government honesty has increased in many countries, but we have stalled or we have gone back, according to this indicator. Now, society. Society is a very broad category. At this moment, the major task for organized civil society is to save the lives of journalists and human rights defenders. For one simple reason. They are the cadres, the backbone for the future. Without these leaders, these local leaders that are everywhere, Mexican democracy has no hope. I am exaggerating a bit, but I do believe that we do need to save the lives of journalists and human rights defenders, because we are the ones who have taken the burden in the past to make the democratic changes, and we are the ones who, in a new deal with the political parties and governments, we have the challenge to rescue democracy from the situation, the decay, the crisis in which democracy is. In the last 10 years, 66 journalists have been assassinated in Mexico. 12 have disappeared. That makes 88. That means we are one of the most dangerous countries in the world for journalists. And the same, if you look at this table, this pie, most of the journalists assassinated or that have suffered aggression are from the written press. 10% from radio, and only 8% of television. And television is the most important media. That gives you an idea who is taking the burden of challenging corruption or organized crime. Written media, not Televisa, not TV Azteca. So at that level, we have the same phenomenon that in the case of political parties. Society has paid the cost that benefit a few, because society has not been benefited by democracy. That's why we have a major crisis. Threats to human rights defenders, and with these two books, I have finished my academic career. This is the end of it. Kaput. I have been 3 years professor and researcher, and I have written more than 20 books, and these two books are what I think the best I can do as a scholar. I am moving to activism full time, because I think that at this moment it's irrelevant to write books. What we need is to save democracy, and to save democracy, we need to develop new techniques, new campaigns in Mexico and abroad, and we need U.S. society. You need U.S. society to understand what is going on in Mexico, in which half of the country is at war. If you don't realize that, then if you are sending troops to Afghanistan and you are forgetting to understand, you are incapable of understanding what's going in your southern border, that's a big problem, big security problem. And because there is a lot to say, of explaining to do in the US, Canada, Europe, and Latin America about what is going on in Mexico, because we need international solidarity. This is the time. Not after the elections. Peña Nieto, López Obrador, Ebrard, or Santiago Krill are not going to take us out of this crisis. It is a systemic crisis. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we all sincerely hope this is not your last written work, at least. But anyway, thank you for that. I'm going to turn now to Professor John Bailey, who has the unenviable task of making some commentary here, primarily on the La Transición en Mexico book, right?
Right. Todd and I agreed to a kind of division of labor, and I guess I'm in charge of history, and he's in charge of transitions and where things are going. It's a real pleasure, real honor to be here, and I've known Sergio for a long, long time. Extraordinary colleague and first-rate analytic mind, operates at many different levels. He also has a wicked sense of humor, and I don't know where that comes from, but it's a sense of humor that appears from time to time. It's just absolutely incredible. And I've enjoyed working with Sergio a lot. We started about 20 years ago on a project on security, and Sergio showed me a map, unforgettable, and it showed what happens if a nuclear weapon is detonated in San Diego. And you know how those concentric circles go out, and they all stopped at the border. There's nothing that happens there. And Sergio said, well, we need to have a dialogue about this. Something seems to be missing about the U.S.-Mexico security situation. And I thought, that's extraordinary. Very accomplished scholar, and the point of this book is that the documents are really the key. They are really the mine that needs to be worked in order to make sense out of Mexican history, in order to be accurate and to be analytically competent. And the book that Sergio's produced, his team has produced, the Transición en Mexico, is a gold mine of documents. The other point I would make about Sergio is he writes very well, and so I hope there are many more books down the road. He's an extraordinarily good writer. And so you have a book he calls these are bricks. These documents are like bricks. And the bricks don't make any sense unless somebody sort of arranges them and puts them in order and then tells you what you're looking at. And in fact, that's what he's done. Thousands of documents, and there is a compact disc that I've looked at a bit, which takes you into each of these documents or shows you the origins of it, and it has the quality of the information is really, really extraordinary. It's organized around an analysis of the regime and a very nuanced understanding of the regime, again based on the documents produced by the regime. You get a sense of the complexity of the old pre-regime. An analysis of the opposition, and you get a sense of the breadth of the opposition from the armed insurgent left to the right, and again a good selection of documents that gives you a sense of what these were about. And the third set of actors are the international actors. And we have also here a whole range of documents that show us at key points the orientations of these, United States for the most part, but also Europe figures in as well. The quality of the documents that we have here is also extraordinary. So I want to commend this to anybody who's serious about understanding the origins of the or the origins of the democracy in the early 1900s, and then the evolution over time to the present. Let me just say, and again to get back to this point about, it's like having a person who, sports metaphor alert here. It's like having a person who's in the middle of the game who steps over to the side and gives you a first-rate analysis of how the game is going. And Sergio is that quality of person, that he's been actively engaged in these struggles for many years, and yet he has this capacity to just step back and say, this is what's really going on here. And we see these changes and those changes, and this is a key point, and we're past that key point, and now the next one to look for is something else. So the commentary as we're going through this is extraordinary as well. I just want to mention a couple points where Sergio captures, I think, extraordinarily rich complexity. Do you remember Governor Madrazo of Tabasco? And Governor Madrazo put on a political campaign to win, which I don't know how many millions of dollars were spent in that campaign. It's an extraordinary river of money that flowed through that state, and he won. And it was a case where President Cedillo tried to remove Madrazo. And the irony, the exquisite irony of the case is, Madrazo was able to mobilize support for his governorship employing democratic ideas and claiming that he had won an election fair and square, and now the central government, in the embodiment of the old pre-dictatorship, was trying to remove him, freely elected governor of Tabasco, and that was to him unacceptable. And then he made a claim about states' rights, that now in the new Mexico, the new democratic Mexico, the old days of the pre-hegemony should not continue, and now in the sovereign state of Tabasco, the governor should be able to maintain it. The irony is exquisite. The other case of the irony, and there's throughout the whole book, the other case of the irony is when there was the effort to convene a group outside of Gobernación to do a Seminario del Castillo de Chapultepec. And it was the gathering of the democratic forces to talk about where the transition might go. And it was held in the rooms of Plutarco Elias Calles. And you can't help but just think, this is exquisite. Plutarco Elias Calles, the architect of the pre-system, and now the democratic transition is gathering in that room to figure their ways out of it. So I want to commend this as a marvelous collection. You had an excellent team, and they've obviously worked very hard, and they produced a first-rate quality of a product. And if I could get a chance to raise a question before we go on to Todd, is the key point is the empowerment of civil society and the understanding of U.S. society. And then you alluded to it, Sergio, but where we need to think about is the civil society can be mobilized, but the institutions, the political institutions, need to be transformed in ways that it can actually channel it, it can accommodate it. And as you know, in the cases of protests with respect to public security, kidnapping and that sort of thing, would be massive protests, but they run up against a police justice system that's not able to channel it or accommodate it, and so it's frustrated. And I think very appropriately you talk about the political party system, and if civil society is mobilized and runs up against the political party system as it exists now, it'll be another series of frustrations and delays. But congratulations on a book very well done.
Okay, and Todd Eisenstadt from American University.
I want to thank also the Wilson Center and also Sergio for inviting me to this very distinguished presentation of two marvelous books. And I also want to share that I came to know Sergio, at least 15 or even more years ago. And like many scholars trying to research archives in Mexico who had great difficulty. In my case, I was doing a dissertation on the electoral courts and sort of how electoral conflicts were resolved through negotiation rather than through formal legal means in the late 1980s, 1990s. And I had been promised access to the electoral tribunal, and then lo and behold, I got there to the tribunal with the letters stating that I was going to be entering the tribunal and that all was well. And then I didn't have access to the archive, which was public, but public within parentheses or within comillas. And so, indeed, I mean, who do you call? I mean, Sergio was one of the couple of people who I think were fighting fiercely for freedom of access to information, to records, to all of the what one would think to be sort of routine public documents of accountability, even at that time and decades before that. So indeed, it's a great pleasure to be able to be part of the story of presenting at least the presentation of this book, because I know also, as John said, that we have before us a very important protagonist in the citizens' rights movements, in the freedom of the press, and the opening of information, of human rights, election monitoring, all of those actions. And now, recently, I mean, the Fundar and its public budget initiative is being taken up internationally. So, and Fundar, which I guess you're not as directly associated with now, but which has had a great impact, I think, in that group of NGOs, the open budget initiatives. So I think that we're very sorry if this is indeed your last book. I personally don't believe it. I'm sure that we'll see another one very soon. The inquietudes have many ways of expressing themselves, I think, right? And I think once you write, I guess we'll see. But I would just say, for this book, that it is the Vuelta en U. It's a fascinating book. It's at least it offers a lot of a historical buildup and hypotheses about what was wrong with the Mexican political system throughout the 20th century. The culmination is Chapter 9, where, in fact, Dr. Aguayo presents something of a radiography of who hijacked democracy in Mexico, of all of the interest groups and the problems and the shortcomings. And it's a fascinating presentation. And indeed, I mean, I think the diagnosis is right on. I mean, I'm incredibly impressed with the data that was arrayed here. And I would just say, though, that I know that it's a manifesto and that it was written with a political intent. It's very well documented, and it's also even-handed in its presentation. I mean, the information itself is shocking, and the presentation is correspondingly so, but it is not tendentious in its writing. But it does emphasize the shortcomings rather than speaking a little bit, at least, to some of the gains of democracy. Just at the very least, the fact that all of the data which you gathered for this book was available, whereas I think 10 years ago it would have been impossible to write this book, because, as I know, after spending 6 or 8 months finally getting into the Electoral Tribunal archive so I could write my dissertation, based in part on recommendations of NGO activists and interest groups from civil society who would help advocate for getting the data, which I would share with them and which would be used in congressional hearings. But I do think that those times have changed to some extent, at least. People do have higher expectations about getting some public information. People have less patience for the runaround, la larga. And I think that there is a changing culture. And so I would just say that I think that while Professor Aguayo doesn't want complacency on the part of citizens, and what he's writing here is a call to action, and therefore perhaps emphasizing what needs to be fixed, I would say at the very least that some things are better than they were, and there may be lessons to obtain from that we could use going forward. So I think that that's something to consider, and that might have been brought out. I understand again that that wasn't the purpose here. And indeed, what Professor Aguayo gives us combines a scholarly eye for discerning trends and patterns with a great journalistic flair for getting the best and most illustrative information. His zingers, his powerful pieces of information and analysis are simply amazing. Through the study of federal budgets from 2000 to 2009, he conveys that, for example, Gobernación has lost a lot of its real budget, and that the governors, as he showed us, are on the rise and have gained incredibly in their budgetary authority, their distribution of budgets, and also without accountability. He also shows us that La Maestra is the head of the National Education Workers Union, has actually created a feudal fiefdom where she conducts excellent marketing and research, pledges votes of several million people, and then delivers them. In exchange, he argues, President Calderón has sort of left that group alone, and in fact she continues to operate in what Professor Aguayo calls a modernization of the corporatist system. So in fact, I guess his argument is about continuity in the Mexican political system more than about change. I would again just argue that there's been a bit of change, and that also might be worth discussing further. But in the points that he raises, I think he's right on. And I mean, he goes on and on in an indictment of the monopolies, of the failure to distribute income, of the inattention by parties and elected representatives to governance and representation of the people. And in short, it's a very sobering but important book to read. I would say that in the manifesto in Chapter 10, where Professor Aguayo talks about having Mexican citizens come together and form citizens groups, turning away from parties and more to direct action. He says that citizens should use judicial authorities more, that they should recur to the international community, that they should not worry about also using financial resources as well as mobilizational skills, and that elections should be made to matter more than they do now. I think he has a great handle on the societal part of the problem. I think that what he could do more, or perhaps I guess what the next generation could do if he's really stopped writing books, which I don't believe, but if that's true, and I guess some of the rest of us will have to try and humbly follow, it seems to me that it seems like he's just given up on the government. And it seems to me that regulatory bodies could still be improved and that structures could still be enacted so that the government itself can provide the upper jaw to the citizens' lower jaw, and that you could have more bite. That, that without both of those jaws together, that you don't have the full impact of improving the quality of democracy in Mexico that you could have, and that there's still a lot of room for improving institutions. And there have been some examples, like the EFI, which gets some mention and some credit. So I think that there are opportunities, and that some institutions have gotten much better, and that following how that happened may give insight into how to improve other institutions as well. I think that in conclusion, I would just say that the deception that some people feel with democracy in Mexico, the disappointment, may be consistent with shortcomings of democracy everywhere. That is that, it's not a panacea and it doesn't offer great solutions. It only offers incremental change. And I guess in many cases that change has been slow, long time coming and not all that impressive. I would also could talk ad nauseum about circumstances in our own country, in this country, which could use a radiography of who hijacked democracy as well. Some people have done something similar, like political economists like Charles Lindblom and journalists like William Greider have done some of this, but we need more. It's time for more of that. So I think Mexico and Mexican scholarship and Mexican citizens have a debt to you for this book, and I look forward to continuing to follow the books that you're not going to write in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll open it up here for questions. I think the thing that comes to my mind as I think about this is that the transition that's happened maybe in your work and that of many others is that the focus has gone from elections and making sure that that's a legitimate space for the expression of people's opinions, and now the focus is on the quality of that democracy. And as hard as the electoral process was, and I know that you struggled mightily in that, I imagine that the struggle for equality and democracy is just that much more difficult and long term, and maybe what we're trying to gently say is don't be discouraged. It could actually improve as hard of a struggle as the quality of democracy is. So I'll start over here with Mark Schneider. Dana's got a microphone. Maybe we'll take the 4 questions on this side, and then we'll come back to some questions on this side. Go ahead, Mark, if you would just identify.
Mark Schneider, Sergio, how are you?
How are you, Mark?
First, I'm with the International Crisis Group now. And just to mention that we're about to begin a project in Mexico looking at some of the issues relating to the impact of organized crime and drug trafficking on state institutions. And my question really relates to some degree to that. You talk in a certain way about two aspects. One, the failures of democracy, and the other, the increasing power, both in terms of geographic and control of organized crime and drug trafficking. My question really is, to what degree is it possible to think about the concerns about organized crime and reducing their role and impact without being successful in reforming democratic institutions? In other words, are these two separate challenges, or is it a challenge that has to be dealt with together? And the second question, to some degree, goes to Todd. Comment and also, actually to all three, really. Can you think about being successful in revitalizing democracy through civil society without being successful in revitalizing democratic political parties, and particularly internal democracy within political parties in Mexico, which hasn't really existed?
Mm-hmm. Let's just take a couple more questions. There was one here, and then I think there were two hands over here. Yes, because of the webcast, folks.
Thank you. My question is related also with civil society, and I'm a human rights activist from Mexico too. I'm currently living here, and I was.
What is your name?
Priscilla Rodriguez.
Oh.
And I was wondering right now what the civil society, it seems that the efforts of the civil society right now are not having the results that we will decide we were having, the desire to have. And I was thinking that the results or the actions that the authority took against for example, the guerrilleros in the Dirty War, killing the people and killing the activism, seems like similar than the acts or the actions that the government has been taking against the human rights defenders and the journalists and the activism in general. So personally, I'm scared to continue with after I finish my studies, to go back to my country and continue with my work defending human rights groups, vulnerable communities, and so on. And I was thinking that if we can, if this is related, or you think is related with the division of the civil society that you describe, about values, about our vision of our society or our country, because seems like Mexican society, as you mentioned, is really divided, and I don't think that there is a hope to change our country if we don't, as a civil society, join our mind and our efforts, like, for example, in Egypt or in these kind of countries that just are showing us how could they really change, with one big organized movement. So that's my wonder, and I don't know if that's the thing that we need.
Thank you.
I'm Marcos Moreno. And following the kind of the same idea about values, Samuel Ramos, a Mexican philosopher, he stated that the problem with Mexico's society is not so much about whether we believe in values or not, so to speak, but it's about our self-confidence. We first look at Europe in the 19th century, and now we are looking at the U.S. as a model to follow. In this context, do you think there's something related to a predeterministic idea of how we conceive society, or you can actually make specific changes in the political system, for instance, to move on? And my quick second question is about what you mentioned in the beginning. It seems to me is what, for instance, López Obrador in his last book, asserted, and that is a huge that inequality in Mexico. Part of the inequality in Mexico is due to precisely the income distribution and how the big businessmen are colluded with the political system and so on. And in this context, do you think that López Obrador, other than he is very stubborn and so on, is not conveying the right idea to his followers and to those independent voters? Thanks.
And then lastly, and then we'll let Sergio respond.
Thank you. I'm Richard Dagey, professor of economics at Johns Hopkins SAIS. You ask for the cooperation and understanding of the United States in the ongoing struggle for democracy in Mexico. Let's get down to the question that we want answered. Mexico exports slightly more oil to the United States than Saudi Arabia, slightly less than Canada. You're our second largest source of oil. Mm-hmm. At what point or when will the degradation of democracy in Mexico affect the flow of oil to the United States?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Several easy questions.
Very easy questions. I start with the comments made by John and Todd, because I think you were right. I didn't emphasize enough. In the book I mentioned it, but not enough. Nor in my presentation, that of course we are in a much better position now than 20 years ago. Society. We have new instruments to empower and to launch a different kind of struggle. Now, here comes the first challenge. We must reach an understanding with the conservative sector of civil society. It is imperative that left and right unite in a common agenda. We are doing that now. I mean, I can tell you that there are a number of initiatives and conversations to establish a set of alliances. To do what? Well, first, we are creating a very small agenda of items, because what we want is, we want many things, but I think that we must establish a new relation with established institutions. It is not that we want to destroy or to throw away the existing institutions. What we want is the reform of those institutions, and what we want is that we, society, are given the share we deserve by the role we play in the transition, and by the representative we have, and by the value, the intrinsic value of the proposals we make. We are succeeding. I can give you a brief example. 1 month ago, the leaders of PRD and National Action Party approached Civic Alliance to request us to organize a referendum in the state of Mexico to ask the people of the state of Mexico if they want an alliance, an electoral alliance in the race, in the gubernatorial race of this year. It is a crucial element in the race for the presidency in 2012. So that was the request. We accepted with 2 conditions. 1, to create an emergency program to protect journalists and human rights defenders. They accepted, and it's going to be announced next week by Gustavo Madero and Jesus Ortega, 3 days before Jesus Ortega leaves the presidency, but nevertheless. So it is a good stepping ground to begin with. Second, that in the state of Mexico, in case they win the gubernatorial, they start a program to give full autonomy to the different institutions that defend different rights. That is elections, transparency, and human rights, and so on and so forth. So it is not that what has changed is it is the end of innocence in the part of civil society. We are not delegating in Paris or governments the responsibility of doing the changes that we must do ourselves in a day-to-day basis, because what we want is participatory democracy, not only elections that count. That's perhaps the main difference, and we are going to do that if we reach an agreement with the conservative sectors of Mexican civil society. So we are uniting, Priscilla. We are uniting within the left. I'm in the left of society, it's obvious, a progressive sector, whatever. I have always been. Second, and that's, Marcos, the case of values. Another task that we have very clear is that we must educate, train, groom a new generation of civic and political leaders with values strong enough to resist the seduction of corruption, because we have a corrupt political system and we must strengthen the morale and the day-to-day life of those who enter politics. And then that in a way answers the question of John and Todd, because I think that I am very optimistic, as a matter of fact. Perhaps I sounded I am critical, but I am not masochist. I mean, I realize that it is the best time ever, because the negotiation for the creation of this emergency program took about 20 minutes. Because the PAN and the PRD needs us at this moment, and they are going to need us until 2012 at least. So if we know how to negotiate with them, they will deliver. It is up to us if we know how to negotiate. That's something that we didn't do. Now, Americans are very patient society. They always, since I came to SAIS in 1975, they have always told me, you must be patient. Democracy at the end prevails. It works. Yes, the question is, do Mexican democracy has the time? Because it is not a normal situation. We are at war. I don't know if half of the country or 40% of the country are in a war-like condition. Therefore, the question is how we are going to deal with that. And the answer is we must develop simultaneously two different strategies. One in which we can be patient with authorities, another in which we work under the logic of conflict. Therefore, we need the advice of our American friends that are like Job, in the biblical, in the Bible, in the book. Job is the most patient saint. I think he's saint, I suppose. All of them are saints, one way or the other. And the Colombians that can advise us how to deal with, how to work in such a condition. Now, Richard, you ask a very good question about that is related. When this situation is going to affect oil production, nobody knows. It is already affecting, for example, the production of gas in Tamaulipas. In the Burgos region, the cartels are kidnapping and controlling the gas wells. Is this going to extend to Veracruz, where they have a strong presence, or the south, or the Tabasco and Campeche? I don't know, but, well, in security studies that SAIS is very good at, teach that a sound security policy is the one that anticipates the danger and not wait until the moment. The question is that nobody can tell you at this moment what is the timing, because that's subjected to so many consequences. Finally, the question of of the relation of drug cartels with making of and the working of democratic institutions, the question is that they are infiltrating municipalities and state governments. It is hard to say how widespread is that, I mean, because the figures are very contrasting. Gerardo Buscaya argues that 50% of the municipalities are infiltrated, but perhaps it's too high, perhaps it's less, I don't know. It's one of the question marks. And so Andrés Manuel López Obrador is another big question mark, because he is pledging thinking in elections. We are thinking in participatory democracy. Therefore, if we have to negotiate with the PRI, we will negotiate with PRI. If we have to negotiate with Andrés Manuel, we will do it, because I respect him personally. But this is not a question of, this is a question of establishing an agenda in which we are going to negotiate with the different powers that be ways how to work. And perhaps eventually we'll have to face the unfortunate reality of having to negotiate with some cartels to save the life of some people. Because the priority, at least my priority at least, and the priority of so many others, is to save the life of the cadres that are going to save democracy at the local level. And that's the most important. How we are going to do that? I mean, we cannot trust the government. That's not a question of trust. That the government is weak, is incapable. I mean, it cannot give protection to a governor elected in Tamaulipas. I mean, how are they going to protect a human rights activist? So that's the situation. These times force us to be extremely pragmatic. That's the challenge we have.
Okay, on this side, we'll start here in the back, and we'll work our way around here. Yeah, go ahead, Patricia. Hold on just a second. We need a microphone.
Patricia Escamilla Ham. I'm a professor at the Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies at National Defense University. I agree with you. Democracy in Mexico has not, the transition to democracy has not been completed, or we have a flawed democracy, one way or the other. System is not working as a democratic system. But there's been talks about different downsides to democracy. So according to this train of thought, democracy has not been all that good for Mexico, if there is a democracy, in terms of security. It has been argued that it is precisely due to democratization, to the alternation in political power, or the dispersion of power, that the organized drug trafficking organizations are out of hand, that they were under control while the priistas were in power, and that now they're all out of control. And so in a sense that it is democracy that is at fault for the crisis of insecurity and violence. What do you think about that?
Joe, and then come back around here.
My name is Joe Dukert. I'm an independent energy analyst and a senior associate in political economics with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I have two short questions. First of all, I must admit that I was very favorably impressed by the move under several presidents to return revenue and revenue sources to the states. And I thought, as a matter of fact, that participatory democracy might have a better chance at the state level than nationally, or the election of governors who were not all of the same party would be good. So my first question is, do you have anything good or hopeful to say about the devolution of authority to the states. The second question is even shorter. Could you describe more specifically the nature of the activism to which you say you are now personally going to devote most of your time?
There was a question there, and then we'll come up here to Dolia before we give Sergio a chance.
My name is Rodrigo Aguilar. I'm a political consultant, and my question goes to the role of local political bosses, not in the national spectrum, but locally in states. Particularly interested in the case of Jalisco and those individuals such as Raúl Padilla and those. I guess most of the states has their tiny Elvis there. So if you found something about that.
Dolia? Hold on a second.
My name is Olia Esteves. Sergio, I have a question. I have followed, I don't know how many years, your work closely with great admiration. And you are just as knowledgeable on U.S.-Mexico relations and U.S.-Mexico history as you are about the internal situation in Mexico. And right now, Mexico and the United States are going through one of their cyclical crises or tensions. I was wondering, in these 10 years of democracy or transition to democracy since the year 2000, what have you seen different from the standpoint of U.S. foreign policy towards Mexico? In which way has the U.S. government and society have adapted or not adapted to a new situation in Mexico? Because we know that during 71 years, the U.S. put security over stability over opening of the political system, over respect to human rights and electoral legitimacy, because they would prefer to have a stable neighbor than a democratic neighbor. This is the Cold War, of course. So I was just wondering, have you seen a different attitude towards Mexico from the U.S. in these 10 years? Or are they just like observers and looking and sending WikiLeaks reports with their perception of what's going on inside Mexico, with not doing anything beyond the issue of Merida and security cooperation?
All right, we have some more questions, but let's give Sergio, we can maybe get one more round in. If
yes, and perhaps John and Todd would like to add something. Yes. Many fundamental questions. I will start with you. Yes, I was a believer in federalism and alternation in power, and but I was naive. As one of the mistakes my generation made was to take at face value the idea that when federalism was a reality, things will be better. That's not the case in Mexico so far. Eventually, that will happen. And then that will take me later, at the end of my comment, to an example, to a regional analysis. No, perhaps I will incorporate the different questions in the answer of your second provocative question, legitimate, the nature of my activism. I want to reconcile with the right, with the conservative right. I mean, that's one thing, and that takes a lot of effort, because it's not easy. We have different agendas, so that is taking a lot of time. But we have to do it, because we have a common interest. We have many differences, so we must isolate. Second, we must unite to have a new deal with the government. We must have a new deal that changes how we work. Third, I am involved in the training of a new generation of civic and political cadres, more democratic, more efficient, and that's a lot of work also. Then, citizen diplomacy in the US, Europe, Colombia, and Central America. Because solidarity, when one mentions solidarity, one thinks of funding, and that's not the case necessarily. Of course, funding is important, but it is more important also the sharing of experiences. And we have a lot to learn from Salvadorians, for example, in how they organized their extraordinarily successful solidarity campaign in the US in the 1980s, or how the Colombians created their program to protect human rights defenders in the condition of war. So solidarity means that we explain to the world our opinion about Mexico, which is different from Felipe Calderon and some others, and I know it, and we request from whoever is interested solidarity, which means receiving information, disseminating information, getting an interest of what's going on in Mexico and so on, and many other activities. I mean, I am giving the broad, very, very, very broad categorization, and then that lands in specific projects that have to be implemented. And finally, that has to be, it has to do with federalism. Federalism does work in some states better than in others. We cannot generalize. And I will give the best example. The best hope for democracy lies in the federal district. Not because the federal district is governed by the left, or something that is called the left sometimes, because I think in René Bejarano and Dolores Padierna, and I don't know if that's the left, but the federal district is a demonstration of the changes that can be done to benefit society in a peaceful way, the participation of society. So the strategic importance of the federal district is enormous. It has 1/3 of the registered NGOs in the country. The next state is Nuevo León with 5% only, out of the 12,000 NGOs registered by the Ministry of Social Development in the SOL. So it is strategic that for us, that doesn't mean that the PRD has to win again in 2012. It means that we are able to resist the conservative offensive against the expansion of rights that we believe dearly. We believe in the equality of women, we believe in gay rights, we believe in many things, and we want to have the right to preserve those values. That brings us to when I speak about the values and the New Deal with government, that brings us to the local level. Every politician has an Elvester in his heart, like Argentinians. Every Mexican has an Argentinian in what's ego? An Argentinian in the heart, according to a joke. I'm sorry, I have very good friends from Argentina. My son-in-law is Argentinian, by the way. So we must work at the local level. And you mentioned Raúl Padilla, but I could mention you as an example, Enrique Alfaro in Tlajomulco, who he's from the PRD as well. The two represents the PRD, and you have the schizophrenia of a party that simultaneously has a mature, modern master in demography as municipal president Tlajomulco, and then Raúl Padilla as cultural cacique of Mexico. Dolia, I haven't seen a change in U.S. foreign policy. I think that they are still. It is amazing. I have worked a lot in archives, U.S. archives. A lot. I mean, I have read thousands of documents. And it is like reading some consular officials from the 50s or 60s. the obsession with the stability in the southern flank is, I mean, overwhelming. It is not that they don't recognize changes, but it is the most important element in the formulation of U.S. foreign policy towards Mexico has to do with the stability. And with an stability we don't have no longer, therefore, I don't know when is going to change. And if Felipe Calderon is not capable, or Felipe Calderon's administration is not capable of portraying here and in the U.S. the systemic crisis, that's the role of society, to explain and to disseminate and to inform in as much circles as... and perhaps, and that brings me to the question of Patricia, democracy and security. I think I mentioned that in Mexico we have a golden opportunity, and so it is the case in the U.S. Egypt and the Arab countries' democratization wave is changing the paradigm that links security and democracy. So it is being recognized in Europe and some people in the U.S. administration that the best security lies with democracy. We must make the same argument for Mexico in the U.S., and we must convince the establishment that the best security that the U.S. can have in its southern flank is a democratic, just, respectful of human rights Mexico. All the other is intrinsicable, unstable, now or in the future. And that's the task of the citizen diplomacy, if you want. I mean, perhaps I am adding too much to the role of society, but it's, as there used to be a generation that, the generation of transition that put elections and federalism at the centerpiece of the democratic dream. Now, the new democratic dream must include a renewal of the agenda and of the instruments that you use, and that includes coming to the U.S. establishment and talk with our friends. We have many friends, not only in this room, but in this society, that are willing to listen, a good solid argument and about why it's important that we have security through democracy. And I think that's what I have to say to these questions.
Okay. At the risk of overextending ourselves, I'm going to take Andrew's got a question, and I think there was one there too. And please keep them very short because we're really down to our last 10 minutes here. So, although Andrew, you can take as long as you want.
The boss.
My job might be
speaking of democracy.
Wait a minute.
Or he's the cacique.
No, dutifully admonished here. Sergio, just a quick comment, actually. Well, two quick comments. One is, I wonder if, or we can talk about this later, but I doubt the conception that the U.S. has of Mexico will ever change. It's about stability. Whether the content of that conception, whether democracy is considered to be part of that conception, whether co-responsibility is tied into that or not, or it's seen simply in terms of keeping up a single party in power, could change, right? But I think you're right. In terms of the long-term vision, that's not going to change. The other comment is, just to pick out something Todd said, I'm completely with you on the need for plural civic activism. But when I look at Mexico, I always see a country that has gone through a change from a system of informal institutions that worked very well. They weren't democratic, they weren't equitable, but they functioned for stability, to a system that is plural but doesn't have strong institutions. And so not throwing out the institute. The need for civic action to really build those institutions. And how do you create a justice system that functions? How do you create police that are credible? How do you create regulatory agencies that can break up monopolies, and allow real competition? How do you create credit institutions that, banks that function, and other credit institutions that allow small and medium and micro businesses to flourish? How do you create institutions? So how do you get citizens not only to push for against what's bad, but also to really push for the creation of institutions. But my question is actually a very quick one, which is, if the PRI comes back, if we believe the polls, and we can believe the polls, but they may change a lot in the next 2 years. But let's say it's a live possibility. The PRI may come back. Can Mexico continue to develop its democracy? Can democracy deepen during 6 or 12 years of PRI administrations, or is that the death knell of democracy?
The gentleman here had a question, and I think we're going to have to make that the last one. I apologize, but
Margaret. Margaret.
Margaret. Oh my gosh,
Oh.
Margaret. Okay,
This
quickly.
Women's Day yesterday.
Women's Day. Okay, we gotta go. All right, make it quick.
My name's Jefferson Morley. My question's about security cooperation. When you talk about U.S. military and intelligence agencies, you're talking about some of the least transparent agencies we have in the United States, working with some of the least transparent agencies you have in Mexico. And so I'm wondering, how can security cooperation work under those circumstances? How can it not become militarization? What are the problems of security cooperation to deal with the warlike conditions that you talk about?
And Margaret.
Bien breve. Sergio, what is the argument that you are going to use with the conservative groups to persuade them that it is in their interest to cooperate with your more populist social program?
In Mexico or in the U.S.?
Well, in both, but especially in Mexico.
Go ahead. Yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
Very briefly. It is them that look for us because they are desperate as we are. It is a question of self-preservation. I mean, all of us are frightened because we see that our friends and families have been kidnapped or threatened. All of us. I can tell you that I have received how many threats I have received in the last year, and it is not me only, it's widespread. So either we react or we will be wiped out by cartels or whoever. So it's, and we are moving very rapidly to agreements in concrete questions. For example, police reform, reform of the judicial system, and so on and so forth, because we are being very concrete. We are, the case of the state of Mexico, we are united in that. I mean, PAN and PRD, so we unite because we think that is necessary for many reasons. Each one has its own calculus. And that's why I put it as an imperative that alliance, because insofar as conservative and progressive civil society unite, then we put an obstacle to militarization or securitization of Mexican political system, which I agree, Jeff, is a possibility. Now, in this regard, geopolitics work in our favor, because the U.S. is not going to gamble with the military solution so easily, because we are neighbors. And the consequences of geopolitics have always been present in the analysis. Mexican presidents have not been skillful enough to use the geopolitical card, or perhaps they had been. I mean, one can discuss that. I do believe that being neighbors give us an enormous set of advantages. We are neighbors. I'm sorry. It's across the border. You just have to go there and look there, and that's very easy. Now, what's going on within the military and the security apparatus, you are right that there is something that has to be looked at very carefully. And there is a danger of militarization, especially if the PRI wins the presidency, because there is this myth that the PRI is going to be able to reach a new the old agreement with the cartels that they had. That's not possible. there is not a central authority to impose that. I can give you as an example Chihuahua and Nuevo León. The PAN lost and the PRI won again, and the security has deteriorated even more, because it is not the crisis of the PAN, the PRD, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or Beatriz Paredes. It is a systemic crisis. I'm sorry to go back. We are facing a systemic crisis of institutions that can be overcome only if it's acknowledged the deepness of that crisis, and only if the elites, be them economic and or political or international, understand that and incorporate, for many reasons, society. Now, you put a very good question about how to make institutions that work. In my experience and opinion, reforms and changes come rapidly if scholars, journalists, and activists unite in a common agenda. If you include plurality, left and right, then that magnifies the impact that it has in society, in political elites and economic elites, because they are also scared of what is going on, and they are in search of answers. And perhaps we must reach the cliff and look down in order to react and start to think that we better do something in our respective acts to come to a minimal understanding of what is the next cycle of the transition. The old cycle, that of federalism and free and fair elections, that's gone. I mean, that's something for the past. The new cycle has to do with the New Deal. I keep coming back to this concept because I think that encapsulates what we need at this moment, and I know it evocates Roosevelt's policies. It is not. It has nothing to do with that Democratic or Republican divisions. It has to do with the need of a new understanding among the sectors of society, and that's, in my opinion, what different people is betting. And I am now negotiating with the former president of Coparmex, which used to be the Confederación Patronal de la República Mexicana, who paid negative advertising against Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and that I criticized harshly that institution. Now we are discussing what are we going to do together. I mean, together, that means tomorrow, not today. I mean, today and tomorrow. I mean, how we can work for this or that or that. And I mean, from that perspective, I am optimistic about the future from that perspective, because we stop dreaming in that one leader or the U.S. or Europe will bring us what we had at our hand, I mean, which is the self-respect and the desire to defend our dignity and the right that we have to participate in our country's government. And that's where I think where lies the real revolution, in the perceptions and the values of many individuals of my generation and the new generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergio. I don't know if you all had any final wrap-up comments. You've given us a tremendous amount to chew on, to think about. I think the next 18 months or 16 months are going to be very, very interesting. Not that everything boils down to an election, but I do think it's an intense time of debate about the future of Mexico, and you've given us a lot to think about, both in your books and in your presentations. So we're very grateful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.